Hey everybody! Part 1 of this video is going to look at the swatches panel in Illustrator, and part 2 is going to look specifically at using and modifying basic pattern swatches. If this subject is totally new to you, I would suggest looking at the Adobe help pages regarding patterns and using and creating swatches in Illustrator. There's a lot of very helpful technical information in here and can really help you troubleshoot any issues that you may be having. Let's start by looking at the swatches panel specifically in Illustrator. For this demo, I find it easier to have the swatches panel open as its own separate unit. So to get that open, go to Window and Swatches, and that's going to open it as its own separate window here. Depending on how you created your file, your swatches panel might look a little bit differently than mine. If you created your file in the CMYK color space, it's going to look very similar to this. If you created it in the RGB color space, your colors might appear a little brighter. And if you opened a file directly from your computer to trace, you may find that you have no swatches at all. And I will show you how to fix this in a minute. First, I'm going to modify my panel using the flyout menu just to make it a little bit easier to see. I'm going to switch to the large thumbnail view, which gives me some larger color icons. If I switch to show list view, I can also change to large list view to see them bigger. It will show me the specific name of every color, including gradients and different patterns that are automatically built in. It also shows me my color groups that have been automatically added to this file when I created it in CMYK. Color groups appear like folders when you're looking at this in any view. If you don't have any swatches, like the example here, you can always get your defaults back by clicking in the lower left of the swatches panel to grab the Swatch Libraries menu and grab anything from here. If you go to default swatches and grab print, that's going to be the default swatches that opened with a CMYK file, but you can also open many other ones from here. For example, if you're working on a portrait and want to pull some useful skin tones, there's a very helpful category of skin tone color groups that might be useful to you. Note that as I'm opening these libraries, they are appearing in a separate box from my actual swatches panel. I'm going to go back to my working file, and you'll see that they still remain open regardless of what file I'm in. To get any swatch from the Swatch Library into your swatches panel, all you need to do is click and drag it. You can drag individual swatches and release, or you can click and drag whole color groups to help with your organization. If you have a photo that you'd like to reference and pull a specific color from, you can use the eyedropper tool. The key command is the letter I, and click anywhere on your photo to pull a specific color. For example, I'm going to grab this light purple here. Note that when I hit that button, it shows up in my control as that purple. It shows up in my swatches panel here, and it shows up in my swatch on the left here under fill and stroke. If I want to add this swatch color into my panel to use again, all you have to do is click and drag. We can customize that color by double clicking over here for our color picker options to increase the saturation, the brightness, or any other setting you prefer to play with, whether it's the hue, the RGB values, or the CMYK values. We can also change it by double clicking on the swatch here and modifying it this way. If a color is set to global, this is going to impact how it behaves when you go to change it in the program. So for example, if I set this color to purple, but I set this color to maybe one of my non-global pinks and click away. If I double click on this color purple because I've decided I want it to maybe be a little bluer, you'll notice that that color automatically changes in any instance where it's already being used in the file. For non-global colors, like that pink that I used, if I double click on that and go to make changes, you're going to see that nothing changes in my document because it's not a global color, despite the fact that it is changing in my swatches panel. By default, swatches are named with their color value, or you can manually type something in here for yourself. If you ever need to grab the hex color for any reason, it'll always appear in this corner. I'm going to hit cancel so that I don't lose my original pink. So far, we've only looked at single color swatches, but we haven't looked at gradient or pattern swatches, which behave slightly differently. The most important thing is that they cannot be added to color groups. You can see how I'm trying to grab either a gradient or a pattern and add them to a color group, and it's not allowing me to. Now we're going to fill each one of these pieces of text with a different halftone pattern, and we're going to modify both the color, the scale of the pattern, and the size of the individual components of the pattern. For a great selection of basic dot graphics, you can actually use some of the predetermined ones in Illustrator. So if I go to my Swatch Library menu and access my patterns, basic graphics dots. Another change you'll notice here is that as soon as you click on one of these, it will automatically be added to your swatches panel rather than having to click and drag it. I'm just going to click on a few to add so that I have some different ones to play with. I'm going to close this secondary window to get it out of my way so that I can work with just these 3 pieces of text. I'm going to change this word that says color to this 4th one that I selected here, so it's a 60 pi dot at 60%. I'm going to change scale to this thinner one here, and I'm going to change size to this middle one that I selected. If we want to modify any of these dot patterns, there's a few different ways to do it depending on the thing you want to change. So let's start by changing the color of these thicker dots here. To do this, I don't need to have anything selected. First thing I want to do here is click on my swatch and drag it over the plus sign in the lower right. That's going to create an exact duplicate. This is not a step you need to take, but it's helpful if you want to preserve the original black and white version of your pattern, or if you want to preserve any iteration of it at any point. Notice that when I duplicated it, the new name is the same as the old one, just with the number 2 after it. To edit a pattern swatch, all I have to do is double click on it, and we enter what's known as the pattern options window. You're going to notice right away that all of our artwork disappeared, and we see just a completely different view here where we're looking at the tile of our art, which is this blue line, and the actual pieces of the pattern that make that up. We're not going to look at the rest of the settings that are involved in the pattern options here today. For now, we're just going to modify the artwork itself. If I click on this, I can grab any of my pre-existing swatches or any swatches that I made. So I'm just going to grab that purple that I created earlier. Click it once, and we notice that the swatch changes to that new color. And if I double click out of this or hit done, my swatch changed in color in my actual menu. To see what it looks like in my artwork, all I need to do is click on my piece and replace it with that new one. If I want to make another change, I can just double click into it again, select the dots themselves, and I can change the color here or using one of these up here. I'm going to change it to a light blue this time, double click away, and notice that this time it updated automatically. That's because the text already had that swatch selected rather than the other pattern swatch. Next, we're going to look at how to scale the pattern. So if we like these dots the way they are, but maybe we want the pattern as a whole to appear a little bit smaller or larger, the easiest way to do this is just going to be to keep your piece selected, and you're going to use your scale tool. Double click on it to bring up the scale menu. The big change that you're going to want to make sure you do is to uncheck transform objects, but leave transform patterns selected. You can also see scale corners and scale strokes in effect. Play with turning these on and off to see what kind of changes happen when you're scaling your artwork. For now, I'm going to leave them all on and leave the preview on just so that you can see the change happening. If I change my uniform scaling, I'm just going to bump it up 150%. And we can see that the dots themselves, as well as the text, both scaled up. What if I only wanted to scale the dots? Well, let's put this back to 100. And this time I'm going to uncheck Transform Objects, and I'm going to scale just my pattern up 150%. And you can see that shift happening. You could also scale it down to, say, 40%, and you get a much more fine texture. I'm going to hit OK to get out of this menu. The last thing you may be wondering how to do is changing the size of the dots in the pattern itself. To do this, we're going to have to go back into the actual pattern editing mode. This process has a few more steps to it, and depending on how you like to work, you honestly might be better off just going back into your basic graphic dots and clicking a couple other ones here to find the one that fits what you're going for best. But if none of these are exactly right and you need to make a change, let's look at how we do that. I'm going to close this window to get it out of my way. To make this change, I'm going to double click on the swatch itself to enter this pattern editing mode again. I'm going to zoom in on my dots, zoom out a little bit. I'm going to select all of them, and I want to do a transform on them. Right now, these dots are moving as a unit. The reason they're doing that is because they're a group. If I wanted to move any one of these dots or scale it individually, I could by either ungrouping it or selecting the specific object with my direct selection tool, and then tapping V to get my handles. I'm going to scale this one up just so you can see that change happening. This can be fun if you want to do something a little bit more custom, but can get a little overwhelming if you are dealing with too fine of a texture. This gives us kind of a neat, more random look to it, which is interesting, but not exactly what we're going for. What if I wanted to change all of these exactly the same? In order to transform each of these individually, we do first need to ungroup them. So we can do Object Ungroup or Shift-Control-G so that they are all now individual pieces. I'm now going to select all of them, and I'm going to go to Object, Transform, Transform Each. This will bring up a completely separate window where we can make modifications to both the scale, the position, or the rotation, and other different effects down here. Just scaling these up, you'll be able to go with just using the scale feature. Notice how now, when I scale these up, I do need to do both the horizontal and the vertical to keep them as dots, but it is transforming each dot individually based on its center point. Once it's at a point that I'm happy with, I can just hit OK and zoom out. And if I'm happy with the look of that, all I have to do is double click, and we notice that these dots got a little bit larger. If we then wanted to scale them slightly, we could do the same thing we did with the scale effect by just double clicking on the scale tool, making sure transform object is off, and we can modify this number accordingly. To go up and down like I am, I just highlighted the number by double clicking on it, and then I'm holding the up and down arrows. If I hold shift, it'll jump in 10% increments. This can just be a nice way of quickly seeing what your changes are going to look like. Once I'm happy with it the way it is, I can just hit OK and then hit Command 0 to zoom out and view my artwork. And that's your look at how to use the swatches panel and the basics of editing your pattern swatches. See you later.